Panel. This debate is not about whether or not superpowers are benevolent or well-intentioned, because usually they're not. The greatest danger to developing countries is that in a single superpower world, they have no meaningful alternative but to accept the terms of one dominant power. Our path to ballot is clear. If we prove that developing countries have more agency, more bargaining power, and more practical ability to improve the lives of their people when superpowers compete for their cooperation, rather than when one superpower can simply dictate terms alone, we win this debate. In this speech, I'll explain why multipolarity translates into better development outcomes for developing countries, and I'll preempt any proxy wars argument by showing why it is non-unique and why it does not outweigh the benefits of our world. A few pieces of setup. First, in the opposition's world, one superpower has overwhelming influence over global finance, trade, security, and other aspects, while in our world, there are two or more superpowers powerful enough to meaningfully compete for influence in those same areas. Second, in both worlds, superpowers have the same incentives to increase their outreach and protect their interests. Our burden is not to show that multipolarity is perfect, rather that developing countries are better off on our side of the house. And third, developing countries are not all the same. Some developing countries are fragile with weak institutions, and they face conflict risk in both worlds, whether through proxy wars, internal conflicts, or resistance to domination. However, many developing countries are stable enough to manage external competition. For those countries, multipolarity does not automatically mean a proxy war. It often means superpowers compete through investment, trade, infrastructure, and more. That competition gives developing countries leverage. The metric in this debate is which role gives developing countries more agency and more bargaining power to improve the lives of their people. First, multipolarity protects agency, sovereignty, and predictability. Developing countries are most vulnerable when they depend on one dominant power for aid, trade, loans, security, and diplomatic support. In the unipolar world, they face a take-it-or-leave-it bargain. If they need development finance, they often have to go through institutions shaped by the dominant power. If they need security support, they must stay in that power's good graces. In most instances, they have to accept the political and economic conditions attached by that superpower, which mean policy and economic concessions that disproportionately benefit the stronger side at the expense of the quality of life of the developing countries' people. This matters because developing countries cannot easily say no. A wealthy country may reject bad terms because it has strong domestic industries, deep capital markets, and stable institutions, but many developing countries need foreign finance to build roads, hospitals, ports, and energy grids and schools. They may rely on imports of fuel, medicine, and food, and diplomatic support to manage regional threats. In their world, the superpower can pressure developing countries to align with its foreign policy, support its wars, liberalize markets before they're ready, or cut social spending without any meaningful external pushback. Whenever there is only a single dominant power, the choice is not truly free. Developing countries are only free to choose as long as their choices do not seriously contradict with the preferences of the dominant power. So why is multipolarity better? Two reasons here. Layer one is it gives developing countries more alternatives and more bargaining power through competition. In a multipolar world, superpowers are not just offering loans, trade deals, or diplomatic support out of goodwill. They do it because they want to expand their zone of influence and access to markets, resources, ports, alliances, etc. Because more than one superpower wants those things, developing countries become more valuable. They are no longer forced to accept the first offer from a dominant power, but they can compare offers and get more bargaining power. This is especially true in trade. Developing countries can technically trade with many states in both worlds, but not every state can replace a superpower level market or investment ecosystem. In their world, if the dominant power uses market access as leverage, developing countries have fewer credible alternatives. In a multipolar world, rival superpowers can offer alternative export markets, supply chains, infrastructure, and investment. That means developing countries can negotiate from a stronger position because walking away from one power does not mean being cut off from the international economy altogether. Superpowers know that developing countries have elsewhere to go, so they have an incentive to expand their zone of influence and offer better market access, more investments, fewer conditions, and more respect for local priorities. For example, when the U.S. withdrew support for Egypt's Aswan High Dam project, Egypt was able to turn to the Soviet Union for funding, and since the Soviet Union wanted influence in the region, they funded the project and allowed Egypt to complete their project. The opposition may say that superpowers are still exploiting developing countries in a multipolar world. We agree that this is true, but we're showing a delta in which deals are comparatively better for developing nations on our side of the house. Layer 2 is multipolarity provides checks and balances against coercion. Opposition may claim that a refusal by developing countries can generate more conflict, but this is untrue. Our world provides more capacity to resist punishment after a developing country says no, because rival superpowers can limit each other's ability to dominate. In a unipolar world, however, the dominant power can use sanctions and aid withdrawal or military pressure with fewer consequences because no other power is strong enough to meaningfully challenge it. In a multipolar world, they can check each other. If one superpower tries to coerce a developing country too aggressively, another can offer backing or financing, which raises the cost of coercion. Second, there is a narrative check. If one superpower backs armed groups, attempts regime change, or violates the sovereignty of a developing country, rival powers can expose it, condemn it in international institutions, rally regional organizations, and make that intervention reputationally costly. In a unipolar world, the dominant power has far more ability to frame its actions as humanitarian, stabilizing, or necessary, because other countries cannot meaningfully contest that narrative. This matters because developing countries are usually the least able to resist pressure alone, often lacking the economic size or military strength to push back by themselves. Multipolarity gives them external support and room to maneuver. While the first layer proves that competition gives developing countries better offers, this layer proves that competition also gives them protection when they reject bad offers. The impacts of these layers are twofold. First, when developing countries have only one dominant partner, they often accept projects and policies that serve the superpower first. Privatized infrastructure that does not serve national interests, investment that imports foreign workers rather than hiring locally, or conditions that force cuts to schools, hospitals, welfare, and subsidies. But in our world, because they receive better offers and are more protected from punishment, they can negotiate better terms that improve people's lives. For instance, local hiring, skill transfer, trade deals with lower tariffs, fewer export restrictions, access to larger consumer markets, and inclusion in alternate supply chains. This translates directly into ordinary people's lives. It means that farmers are getting more routes to sell their crops, workers are getting more jobs and skills, businesses face lower transport costs, and governments have more room to protect schools and hospitals. My second speaker will add a final layer on why our side spreads risk for developing countries and how developing on the internal politics dynamics of a single superpower is bad for them because they can suddenly shift their foreign policy priorities in a single election cycle. But finally, opposition may say that multipolarity creates proxy wars and generates more instability, but we have three responses here. First, this is non-unique. In a unipolar world, developing countries and local populations can still resist domination by the single superpower, and that resistance can still produce sanctions, repression, intervention, insurgency, or instability. Their world is not conflict-free. It is a world where conflict happens under one unchecked power. Second, multipolarity is different from the Cold War era. Today, superpowers are deeply connected through trade, finance, supply chains, and energy markets, and investment, which means they often compete through trade deals, infrastructure, technology, market access, and diplomatic support rather than only through military proxies. It also means that any instability in a given region generates economic harms for both sides. Third, many developing countries are stable enough to manage external competition, and for them, multipolarity means being courted with investment and partnerships, not turned into battlefields. So while proxy conflict is a risk, it does not outweigh the broader structural benefit of our world, in which developing countries have alternatives, bargaining power, and checks against domination. In opposition's world, if a single superpower pressures you, you are isolated. But in our world, you have somewhere else to turn, and that is why I am so proud to propose in today's debate.